Welcome back to another episode of the War Report. It is just me again this week. Unfortunately, GSP could not join us, but we still have quite a bit of news to cover in Ukraine, in the global events surrounding Ukraine, such as the NATO summit, which is taking place right now, as well as plenty of news out of the Middle East and also some U.S. domestic politics and European news, of course. So a little bit here and there, and we're going to get right into it. And I'm going to start with a brief update on Ukraine. So, starting in the south, in the Orikhiv direction, you have the same gradual Russian advances we've seen for the past several weeks at this point, where the Russians, little by little, continue to advance, and the Ukrainian forces, having been depleted of a great many resources, with exhausted manpower, once again continue to recede little by little. Now, there are areas of much fiercer resistance, such as Chasiv Yar, which we'll talk about in a few moments here. You also have the same case in the advancing along Staromayorsk and Ugledar as well. And there have been reports of Krasnogorovka being taken by the Russians, and that the Ukrainians are slowly starting to abandon the position, which is once again just south of Chasiv Yar, which I know is going to be what everyone wants to hear about. Similar situation in Karlovka and along the front near Oche Terne. And you do see this trend continue along the front. Of course, New York, that being the renamed city in Ukraine, what was originally Novgorodskoye, when it had the proper name, of course, but the small town, the village named New York, it is falling to the Russians right now. That's another, you can't exactly call it a stronghold, but it was another Ukrainian position that was pretty well fortified and that they are losing grip on. But with the situation in Chasiv Yar, the Russians have faced fierce resistance. Now, don't believe Ukrainian media reports where 99,000 Russian forces have been casualties in the Chasiv Yar front. Once again, we're talking about 10 times the size of what Chasiv Yar would actually be. I think at least in its pre-war population. And this is, of course, in the Bakhmut direction. This is the next major stronghold after Bakhmut. And Chasiv Yar, of course, was also one of the main hubs along the Eastern Front during World War II for the Germans as well. It is on a elevated, higher ground. You have had, like I said, the Ukrainians dug in there for quite some time. And once again, to their credit, even though it is costly, much like what you have on the front in Kharkov, which we'll discuss in a few moments here, the Ukrainians have put up a resistance at the cost of a lot of manpower, and they need uh, these areas to hold because, first and foremost, what it always comes down to is the confidence of the donors, the confidence of the sponsors of the Ukraine war. That being NATO, especially with the NATO summit right now, especially with Zelensky up there rubbing elbows with all the NATO heads of state and the comments we have there. They need an impressive showing of defense, showing that the Ukrainian armed forces, the AFU, can hold its territory, can defend its territory amid adverse conditions, much more adverse conditions than they're used to. Because you look at the amount of aid, the amount of equipment that's come so far, the alleged shortages on some of the equipment that a lot of Western countries have run into, where they're trying to procure the ammunition for Ukraine, they're trying to procure the supplies for Ukraine, and trying to force through aid packages despite some resistance in some countries, even on a legislative or governmental level. And with that, of course, there's the symbolism, and then, as we talked about, there is the actual strategic significance. It is the raised ground in that direction in the Donbass region, which, once again, I think that if we're looking at the overall Russian aims, at least in the short term, they need to I don't want to put an exact time frame on it because I've been made a fool of before in this war for doing so. But primarily, the Russians need to secure control of the Donbass. And right now, not controversial, not my take, but Chasiv Yar is the biggest stumbling block in the way of that. And it is the point of the most harsh Ukrainian resistance. And like it is because of that raised ground. It is because of its location, its positioning along the highways. It makes it much easier to supply than say a lot of other areas on the front. And once again, to their credit, they're holding it. And it's been I don't want to say it's been going good for Ukraine or that it's been going in Ukraine's favor, but it's held out much longer than what a lot of people would have expected. A lot of people expect this to be over in a few weeks or even a few months. Even I said going into this battle that I mean, I thought this was going to be a much quicker battle, but you look at the entrenchment and especially with the positioning of the canals, it has provided an invaluable defensive barrier for the Ukrainians at that point. And I don't want to say it's renewed confidence in the war because you look at what the media reports and you look at just the general atmosphere of pessimism on Ukraine's prospects moving forward in the war, especially from the Western media. It does seem that they're playing the usual routine. It creates the sense of desperation, and it also creates the sense of doom and gloom, trying to, of course, drum up more aid, and they go back and forth depending on what the narrative dictates that day. But it's vital, especially during the NATO summit, especially while Zelensky is staking his reputation and the reputation of the Ukrainian armed forces on this, for this city to hold. And like I said, to their credit, it hasn't fallen yet. It is a matter of time, but how much more pain can they inflict on the Russians until that happens, I think, is the real question, and how much longer will that take is also the real question, which, once again, I don't want to speculate on because everyone expected this to be a much quicker affair than it has been, and you don't want to start just throwing around empty guesses because, look, I've been guilty of that a few times. I think everyone who's followed the events in this conflict has been guilty of it at some point, but I do think the forces in Chasiv Yar, especially with the kind of troop rotation that Ukraine has been employing now, it's not ideal, but it's better than what it was, where they will move out the more elite forces like the Kraken forces for the regulars and then down to the conscripts. And look, it's far from ideal. The Ukrainian manpower issue, the Ukrainian morale even, is far from ideal. But like I said, it has provided much more than, frankly, I think I could have expected when this battle started. And despite whatever you might think about Ukraine, I'm stunned. I do have to give credit to the fighters there for being able to hold this. Now, what will this look like after the NATO summit's over, after Zelensky gets up there and does his grandstanding and makes a scene as he always does? Perhaps the defense is weakened. I don't know. But I do think it has moved beyond, and I know I've addressed this before, the idea of symbolism, the idea of it being a sign of resistance, into the point of brass tacks. This is something that needs to hold for the sake of the actual Ukrainian war effort. Now, will all of Ukraine collapse tomorrow if Chasiv Yar falls? No, of course not. But in terms of the defensive lines it has dug in the Donbass in order to deny Russia the rest of the Donbass, which I think at this point is the most feasible Ukrainian strategy given what they're trying to accomplish. Now, I think overall it is completely foolish. I think Ukraine's strategy going into this war is completely foolish just as a whole. But given their stated goals, given what they want to do, if we're to take Zelensky, for whatever reason, at his word, if we're to take his inner circle at his word, the Ukrainians do need, for the sake of their reputation, for the sake of Western support in this war, to deny Russia control the entirety of the Donbass for as long as they can, no matter what it costs. Now, in the end, this is going to be disastrous for them, especially with the manpower losses, the equipment losses. It's just not sustainable, especially considering what they're paying versus what they're getting out, the damage they're doing to the Russians. Not that the Russians are getting off easy, not that this is some greatly lopsided war, but you compare the casualties, you compare the loss of equipment, you compare the loss of troops. It's just not comparable, despite what some of the media, of course, want. In fact, most of the media want you to think, what Western governments want you to think. It's just not comparable. Now, moving on, just I don't want to dwell on the issue of Chasiv Yar forever. Just some movements along the north. The most significant movement, I would say, after that would have to be in the Volchansk direction. You do have the Russians continuing to push in Volchansk, in the Kharkov Oblast, which you're starting to see them break through towards the territory that Ukraine did take back in the 2022 counteroffensive and regain their footing there. And this was the main news story of, I believe it was in May, about a couple months back, about the quote-unquote clearing operation in the Kharkov Oblast in order to alleviate pressure because of the strikes on Belgorod, which there were more strikes on Belgorod and into parts of western Russia that have been quote-unquote approved for use of U.S. weapons into western Russia, even though, as I get into the NATO summit, I'll discuss some of the finer details of that. But you do have the Russians actually starting to make breakthroughs back into the territory they had lost in September 2022. And the speculation is, which I don't think is unreasonable, if we're to see any great Ukrainian push in the fall or through the rest of the summer, if we're to see, if they try to repeat the 2022 counteroffensive, it likely is going to be in the Kharkov Oblast. Now, I know I was just saying that for the sake of image, for the sake of how Ukraine wants to portray itself, denying Russia the Donbass is probably the most reasonable thing they can do given their stated goals. And of course, I don't think they're going to abandon the Donbass front by any means. They are going to, in my opinion, continue this active retreat that we've been witnessing for the past, at least since the beginning of this year, and even going back to the failure of the 2023 counteroffensive, where they do put up a fighting retreat, where they do cede ground, but do make the Russians pay a price for it. But I do think in terms of any effective counteroffensive, it would have to be a push in the north. Now, will the Russians abandon their positions like they did in September 2022 and retreat back to more defensible lines? Given the size of the operating force in Kharkov, the fact that this doesn't look like a proper offensive force when this was building up, I don't think so, honestly. But I don't think that they're going to fight tooth and nail for this ground, that they are willing to cede this ground. But the main goal of this operation, in my opinion, once again, was to alleviate the pressure on some of these parts of western Russia where cities in Russia proper were being shelled, and cities in Russia proper were being attacked, and that you were having men of these so-called quote-unquote freedom legions, or whatever they wanted to term themselves, moving into these areas and slaughtering people. And if they can hold that line, if they can stave those off, because, of course, first and foremost, you don't want that to happen to your population. Secondly, it's bad for your image. Then, in many ways, if those have been staved off, you could consider this recent incursion into Kharkov, back into the Kharkov Oblast, not the city of Kharkov, just to clarify. You could consider this operation a success, even if they do have to cede some ground. But once again, it does make you wonder, especially with Ukrainian recruitment numbers, especially with conscription numbers, equipment supplies, how effective of a pushback can they perform in this sector, or just in any sector, really. And I know a lot of people, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of people who want to triumph the end of the Ukrainians anytime there is a Russian success. And of course, on the other side, and I would say actually much more egregiously on the other side, there are a lot of people on Ukraine's side who want to triumph the downfall of the Russian Federation as a whole every time Russia experiences a battlefield setback. But I do have to wonder, with how Ukraine has expended its armed force, with how Ukraine has expended its funds, its equipment, how many more times can they do this? How many more men can they call in the service? I mean, we have numbers coming out that since the start of the war, 400,000 men have found a way to avoid conscription. Whether that be through legal means, whether that be through illegal means, we're talking 400,000 men. Of course, many of them from Western Ukraine found ways around deferments and did the quote unquote legal way, of course, and had the connections to get out of that service. But with the manpower, I genuinely do not know how much longer Ukraine can do this without any sort of significant outside intervention, I should say. Not just outside intervention in general, but significant outside intervention. But just some other brief battlefield updates. You do have the Ukrainians digging in and mining Seversk. You have Russian advancing in Vokshod in the Avdiivka direction. And in the Zaporozhye direction, you do have motorized rifles of the Russian armed forces moving west on the N08 highway. And in Toretsk, the Ukrainians are resisting the advance towards New York, or Novogorodskoye, Kirovo, and Druzhba. So they are putting up a heavier resistance there because, of course, the Russians have been advancing into New York or Novogorodskoye. And in South Donetsk, as I'd covered before, the Russians do continue to advance towards Krasnogorovka, Konstantinovka. But probably the other biggest piece of news since is this incident in Kiev with the Children's Hospital and the destruction of that as a result of Russian strikes in Kiev. So, over the past few days, there have been Russian strikes in Kiev, Zhytomyr, and Chernigov, striking strategic targets, particularly command centers of the Ukrainian armed forces, and of course their NATO handlers are certainly there as well. And as a result, a children's hospital was hit. Now, immediately, the finger started pointing. Of course, this was a Russian terror bombing tactic that they took this out just for that reason, just as a show of might, as a terror bombing. Then it was accused that Ukrainian air defense missiles fell down on this, and that Ukraine placed its air defense positions and placed these strategic positions near the civilian targets, knowing this would happen. You actually had some debate in the Ukrainian legislature, the Rada, about this exactly, where you did have MPs of the Ukrainian legislature criticizing the Air Force Command in Ukraine for its positioning of these troops, for its general strategy towards this war when it comes to those positionings and the civilian cost that it has. So, in my opinion, I don't think the dust has settled enough to really come to a conclusion on this. Not that, look, I don't want to paint completely morally good, completely morally evil pictures. I've always tried to take a much more balanced approach when it comes to not only covering this conflict, but any story. And I don't want to say the Russians would never, or they would disregard civilian targets in the interest of hitting a military target. Because they would. We have seen this in this war, unfortunately. Although civilian casualties are much lower than, say, a lot of other wars that have taken place, especially in recent history, and especially right now. One can look at the situation in Gaza for a comparison. It still happens in this war. And I don't know, perhaps there's blame for both sides, but I just wanted to briefly address that. I don't want to dwell on it too much because it's a new story. It just happened on Tuesday. I'm recording on Thursday right now. And next episode, I will come back with an update on that. But in my opinion, the jury is still out on what actually happened with this, whether this was Russian incompetence. I think we can rule out that this was A, Ukrainian false flag, or B, a Russian terror bombing. We can rule out both extremes on that. And feel free to disagree with me on either of those points. Please make a case for either of those points if you do feel inclined to. But we can either chalk this up to Russian disregard or Ukrainian underhanded tactics when it comes to placing their strategic military assets, or perhaps a bit of both. Because, I mean, this criticism gets thrown around with Israel all the time, where Israel will level an entire neighborhood over one weapons cache that Hamas allegedly had in Gaza. And we've seen this for years. And that excuse tends to work that Hamas is violating international charters, committing war crimes by hiding these weapons caches in civilian areas. But, I mean, much by the same logic, we do see this in Ukraine as well, where this does happen. But like I said, I don't want to dwell on this too much. The jury is still out, in my opinion. What it probably was, I do tend to lean towards the narrative that there were Russian strikes on these areas, Ukrainian air defenses engaged, and then the debris of that engagement landed in a civilian area that just so happened to be the worst of all targets, Children's Hospital. Now, we have seen this narrative before. We have seen this narrative crop up before, not only in this war, in several wars. I'm sure you all remember the propaganda they pushed, especially about Syria. When they really wanted to get involved in Syria, they would always have these kind of stories. There was also a story much similar to this, except that one was, I can't remember whether that was in Kiev or not, but the one towards the beginning of the war with the maternity ward that was allegedly hit, and then they had that woman with a very odd background who was interviewed, who was allegedly there during the strike. So this is nothing new for this war, and even when it comes to narrative spin, we have seen this story before. I would just tell everyone with this, approach this with a heavy deal of skepticism, no matter what they tell you, especially with the phase the Ukraine war is in, with how much more desperate the situation is getting for Ukraine, and that the drumming up of public opinion behind the Ukrainian cause, especially going into Biden's re-election, especially off the heels of the UK election and the French election, where Ukraine was a very big issue in both of those. One of the key issues in terms of what's the approach to Ukraine going to be, and it's turning out to be a major issue in the U.S. election as well. So, like I said, just apply a heavy dose of skepticism towards any of these kind of stories coming out of Ukraine lately, because we've all seen the atrocity propaganda before, and we've also seen it debunked in real time. And I don't want to go as far as to say that what happened with the Kiev hospital is debunked already, but there have, with some things that have come out, there are things that do cast some doubt on the official narrative, as is to be expected with that. And continuing on from that, with the news surrounding Ukraine, the idea was floated of placing air defense systems in Poland to intercept Russian strikes on Ukraine, while also shielding the air defense systems from Russian retaliation, because if they're in Poland, Russia cannot retaliate lest they risk dragging NATO into the conflict altogether. And this proposal is hot off the heels of Zelensky and Donald Tusk, the Prime Minister of Poland, signing a so-called 10-year security agreement between the two countries. And this is also accompanied with the plans to form a Ukrainian legion of the Ukrainians in the diaspora who've been displaced by this war in Western Europe, to bring them back to Poland, to train them, and put them on the front. And they've talked about this for months now. We've had Ukraine suspend diplomatic and consular services to men who did not come back to re-register their documents, that they couldn't re-register them, leaning on Western governments to begin extraditing Ukrainian men fit for service to return there. And with this Ukrainian Legion, quote-unquote, forming in Poland, it, of course, would form... it'd be formed of other nations in Europe, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, of people who would want to go in and, quote-unquote, volunteer in Ukraine. Now, who knows how many of these people are being press-ganged, but the Ukrainian media, quoting Zelensky, says, "We have a very positive experience of the Ukrainian Polish-Lithuanian Brigade." So, really playing on the strings of getting the Commonwealth back together, really trying to speak to, I guess, those latent Polish irredentist feelings. Which, what better way to go about this? What better way to drum support for this kind of war than going to the media, your Zelensky, going up to them and saying, using the phrase particularly Polish Lithuanian. Now, you notice he threw Ukrainian in there, maybe trying to rewrite history a little, maybe trying to give the Ruthenian possessions of the Commonwealth a bit more privilege than they actually had in reality. Like I said, I could do an entire show on the Commonwealth and getting into the intricacies of what exactly happened with that very interesting European state. But once again, he's invoking those words, he's invoking that imagery of getting the gang back together in order to fight back against the dreaded Muscovites. I would be impressed somewhat. Let's not go too far. I might be impressed if this wasn't just so sickeningly put on as everything Zelensky does. Once again, this man was an actor, a very crude actor at that, and you can look at some of his filmography, and it doesn't lend itself to, I don't know, any great works of art in our modern age, at least in my opinion. Perhaps I'm just wrong about that. But going back to the security agreement with Poland, the idea was floated once again of having them field Ukraine's air defenses. We've heard ideas like this before, such as the F-16s we give to Poland are going to take off from NATO territory, land and arm in Ukraine, and then engage the Russians in battle, trying to launder their military involvement in Ukraine, as we've seen before. This is a rehashed version of that. This is nothing we haven't seen before with just that. And of course, trying to bait the Russians, saying, if you strike back, then you're at war with us. And mind you, some might say this is bloviating, some might say this is posturing, but this is in light of, I believe it was actually over Western Easter weekend, which would have been March 30th, March 31st, where Ukraine expanded their conscription laws. No, excuse me, Poland expanded their conscription laws just overnight, and it was, like I said, a few days before Western Easter when most of the public would have been distracted with the holiday. They implemented much harsher conscription laws. I know that the guys at the Duran, which once again a very good resource to go to when it comes to a lot of this stuff, I would certainly recommend a lot of their analysis. But they covered that. Like I said, this was at this point 2.5, almost 3 months ago. Yeah, about 2.5 months ago. So the idea of trying to expand this war, trying to bring in more troops in this war, it's not unreasonable. It's not something that's that far fetched or out there that they're trying to extend this, especially with the proposal of this Ukrainian Legion, trying to rally what manpower they can. And I know that on this show we have talked about before when the initial discussion of extraditing Ukrainian diaspora to fight in the war was brought up, that it would be feasible for a lot of these countries, especially in Eastern Europe, to send their own willing volunteers, for example, Poland, Romania, Lithuania, etc., 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 in the place of these Ukrainian men, claiming to be quote-unquote Ukrainian, in order to funnel fresh and even, let's just say, more willing troops into this battle, into this war. And I'm not sure how far this will go exactly. I'm not sure if this will be an issue that they press. Once again, something they'll go back and forth on. It's something they'll pick up on. I'm sure they'll get some small amount to come back, or some small amount of men from third-party countries to take the place of these Ukrainians because they want to fight in this war. And of course, I mean, the Ukrainians already have an international brigade, but they would take any man they can. I know there were some reports in Zakarpattia and Transcarpathia of them abducting tourists. Now, I do have to wonder who at this time, even in the westernmost reaches of Ukraine, would be there as a tourist. I don't know. I look. I know this area has been largely untouched by the war, but just given the political climate and just the potential of the war, or even just any sort of airstrike or drone strike reaching somewhere there, it's not a risk I would personally take. And once again, these are unconfirmed reports, but this is the Ukrainian armed forces we're talking about, which we've seen their conscription campaigns, we've seen their press gang campaigns, where they do throw men in a van off the streets and take them off to be conscripted in the military. And would they do that to foreign citizens? I mean, they've done that to dual citizens, people who hold citizenship in both Ukraine and the United States, or Ukraine and some other country. They've done that before, so it's not out of the realm of possibility that something like this would happen. And with the proposed plans for Ukraine, Andrzej Duda, the current president of Ukraine, who is still affiliated with Law and Justice, despite the fact that Tusk and his more quote-unquote center-left party are the ruling party in the cabinet in the parliament, Duda has expressed some doubts about this plan. He has always been a very strange character in this war because he very much takes the bog standard pro-Ukraine position, especially being Poland, especially being the country on the front line. But when it comes to any serious action, he always gets cold feet. And I think that's a good thing. I don't think that Poland should get involved in this war. I think it would be a tragedy to see this war expand to yet another country and see yet more blood spilled over this same conflict. So I'm not complaining that Duda frequently backs down on this rhetoric or frequently changes his mind on these things, but to his credit, when the possibility of more real commitment to this war comes up, there's always a hesitation. I'm not saying he wouldn't do it. I'm not saying he's incapable of doing it. I'm not even saying that he's principally opposed to doing it. But for whatever reason, whether that be pragmatism, whether that be, I don't know, the grander strategy that comes out of NATO itself, he always backs down, or almost always backs down. There's a reason you don't have Polish troops in Ukraine today, despite what I was convinced was going to happen in 2002 and part of 2023. And there is a reason for that, and I do think that they will continue to reject this plan, and while they will, of course, continue military aid, you even had Poland coming out saying, if you compensate us for giving up our old MiGs, then we'll give Ukraine our entire air fleet. This is the country that also gave Ukraine half of its tank fleet at the beginning of the war, of course in hopes of compensation, hopes of receiving newer Western units in their place. And there were some fierce negotiations over that, which to this day I do not know if they're fully resolved. But like I said, this is a country that is fully on board with supporting Ukraine, but when it comes to being the next ones in line, as maybe George Soros would have put it, to be in that meat grinder, reality kicks in. And I sincerely hope that when faced with this prospect, when faced with a greater threat of this war affecting your nation and your people to any of the leaders of Europe, that the same reality kicks in that this is no longer just money and arms and supplies going to a conflict in a different country. This is potentially my countrymen, as far as I don't know any European elite really cares about their country or its people anymore, who would be coming home in body bags. And like I said, I hope that thought frequently crosses the minds of European leaders, and that for whatever faults they might have, they follow through with those thoughts and realize that this is not a cost that we can either A, afford to pay, or B, should be paying at all, especially given the circumstances. And I know Orban's peace mission has largely been roundly condemned by virtually anyone who's anyone in the European Union, but I do hope when also faced with that possibility, there is some introspection, and they realize maybe his proposals are not as ridiculous as what he brings up, what Orban brings up, the idea of continuing dialogue with the Russians and even the Chinese at that point. But moving on to the Washington, D.C. NATO summit and its relation to Ukraine. First off, it was stated at the summit that Ukraine is on a quote unquote irreversible path to NATO. Now, what I hear when I hear that being stated by NATO officials, they've taken away every motivation the Russians would have to actually sit down and negotiate. Now, I know that NATO's position since the beginning of this war is Russia has to concede everything and then we can enter into negotiations because they have to be lopsided negotiations. They can't be any real talks, any sort of real agreement. It has to be one side dictates the terms, the other side nods and accepts it. But the major stumbling block, and as all of them said, is because Ukraine is an active conflict, we cannot accept it into the alliance. But once the active conflict is over, Ukraine will be granted NATO membership. If we're to take them at their word, then yeah, that absolutely it's going to be the case. In which case, the Russians have no reason to pursue any sort of peace agreement until they get guarantees from the Ukrainian state of their neutrality, and assuming that they don't take more direct control of Ukraine. And I know that there were talks of in the Russian media of how much of Ukraine they should take, and they said after a certain point, especially Western Ukraine, which has been evident since the beginning, would be more trouble than it's worth to take. But they even hinted that going further than the current annexations, or much further than the current annexations, with some Russian officials on Russian state media, it would be costly and it would possibly be more trouble than it's worth. So in terms of Russia's ultimate goals, those are still rather arbitrary, and we could see how that would turn out. And of course, Putin put out the peace proposal just before Orban's visit, and just before, I believe this was about 2 weeks ago, where they freeze the conflicts along the lines, and Ukraine recognizes and withdraws from the annexed oblasts from September 2022. But that deal was, of course, routinely rejected, that ceding 20% of Ukraine's land in order to preserve what it has left as a nation was not a worthwhile deal, and that they're going to push this, and that they're going to continue on and prove their right to be in NATO. That has been one of the prevailing narratives since the beginning of this war. I think a lot of people have forgotten. Ukraine is out here fighting on the front lines to guarantee its spot in NATO, to prove that it is worthy of being a member and that it can be a bulwark against Russia. At which point they're defeating the alleged purpose they want to be in NATO. So this entire discussion of Ukrainian NATO membership has been self-defeating from the beginning, because it was supposed to be a defense against this supposed Russian aggression that was coming, which eventually outright hostilities with Russia did break out for a number of reasons. But then after that, the narrative shifted. Ukraine is earning its spot in NATO by negating the role of it in the first place. Because if we're to take the triumphalists at NATO at their own word, if Ukraine was in the alliance, say, in 2008 like they intended, this war would have never happened, because it would have brought down the full might of NATO on Russia as a response for this. Which it very well might have. I don't know to what degree they would have responded, to what degree this alliance is a paper tiger, but I can tell you, at their quote-unquote 75th anniversary summit, this did not seem like a healthy and vibrant organization. It seemed like a decrepit and ailing organization. And I think that's the key takeaway. And what better representative of that is there than Joe Biden's speech, where, once again, it was better than his debate performance, don't get me wrong. Now, of course, the ground was his. He got to speak however he wanted. But the man sounded half dead. He slurred his words. He had trouble pronouncing things. Once again, it was just what you would expect from Biden. And didn't look like he had a clue where he was. Like I said, it wasn't as bad as his debate performance. But at the end of the day, he stood up there in front of the rest of the NATO leadership, the heads of state of NATO countries, as well as their delegations and the people they brought with them, being the quote unquote leader of the free world, the leader of the most powerful country in the alliance, and this is the example that he made. Now, Zelensky's speech was even better because it was just the same hammering and yammering on about the usual things: give more money, give more aid, guarantee Ukraine's spot in NATO, don't give up because of Russian aggression, and we're worried about Donald Trump. Don't let him cut off my endless supply of funds. That would be a tragedy. Of course not. We can't allow that to happen. But with that being said, it was a rather lackluster summit. In terms of actual agenda items, beyond stating that Ukraine is on the irreversible path to NATO that it's been on since 2015, since 2014, they were Zelensky was bloating about this on Twitter all the way back in 2021 about Ukrainian NATO membership. And it's simply not going to happen because there are only a few possibilities we can look at here. That is, Russia takes a maximalist take on this war and has a maximalist goals in this war and completely subjugates the Ukrainian state. Now, how much territory would actually be annexed versus how much would be placed under a friendly regime? Irrelevant details to the question at hand. But in that scenario, Ukraine's not joining NATO. Ukraine might barely even be a country at that point, depending on how ridiculous you want to make this scenario. Scenario 2 is this conflict continues in perpetuity. Maybe it becomes a frozen conflict that's still ongoing, but by NATO's own rules, Ukraine can't be admitted. Or Ukraine does get quote-unquote admitted, which leads to either A, the alliance being unable to fulfill its obligation, thus delegitimizing itself, or B, spirals into a conflict that I don't think any of us want to see. I certainly don't want to see it. But you do have to wonder, given the narrative that we have seen with NATO, with its security guaranteeing capabilities as it loves to triumph itself on, with a lot of these countries, with how Ukraine is faring, even as, let's just say, an unofficial member of the alliance, with how much aid it's gotten, how much confidence does Lithuania, for example, have in its defense of NATO? How much aid would Lithuania get? And if Ukraine is struggling with the amount of manpower and resources it had ahead of time, plus what it's gotten from the West, what chance does a Baltic statelet stand? I guess when it comes to countries in that region, the close one that could probably put up a fight is Poland. I don't see, for example, and that's assuming the Russians would even go this far, which I don't believe for a second they would, just given what their stated goals are and just the reality of the situation. I guess the Romanians probably could muster some sort of force, but I don't foresee it lasting very long in terms of the kind of manpower they would gather. Hungary, if we're to assume that Orban isn't just this terrible Russian puppet, or I don't know, maybe there's some other government in power if Orban is this terrible Russian puppet, according to the media, according to the usual suspects. It's a nation of 10 million. That's not capable of putting up a defense. And at the end of the day, these countries that joined NATO in 99, in 04, in 08, or tried to in 08, but these countries that have joined since the subsequent NATO expansions have worked themselves into a position where they believe they have this bulwark against Russia when they are indeed a bulwark, the bulwark against Russia. It is Poland that would, in the scenario of a NATO-Russia conflict, be bearing the casualties and the human cost of this war when it comes to actually being on the front lines. It would be Poland having their country devastated. It would be Romania having their country devastated. It would be the Baltic states having their countries devastated. And that's the narrative we're pitched about NATO. That's for these countries' defense. But at the end of the day, it just turns them into the meat shields. And I'm not saying other countries wouldn't suffer. They wouldn't take casualties in this. Of course they would. But in terms of the countries that have the most to lose, it does seem, for whatever reason, they're the most eager to jump on this and to engage in escalatory rhetoric. I can't explain it. Now, as it stands now, Ukraine is stonewalled from NATO. Even if we're to assume that somehow they could get in, there's three major obstacles at least that they would have to jump over. That being Hungary, Slovakia, and Turkey. Fico is recovered at least mostly from his assassination attempt, and one of his first statements was, "We're not going to support any further Ukrainian integration into NATO. We're not going to support Ukraine's ascent into NATO." And now the next pet project is a joint agreement of NATO states to begin moving Ukrainian troops to Germany for yet another training program. Now, Hungary has stated that it's outright not going to participate in this, and I can't imagine they're the only nation that won't participate, but they're the only ones who have come out so far and have actively rejected the proposal to participate in this. But make no mistake, they do intend to keep this war going for as long as they can. Even if they don't intend to keep it up at this intensity, I've said it before, we've speculated on this before, I do believe that they see it as a completely reasonable option to keep this war going on as a slow burn, as a constant thorn in Russia's side, as something that's constantly in the background, that delegitimizes whatever political authority is in power in Russia, that serves as a small siphon on Russian resources, and at that point, a lesser extent, manpower. But I do think they view that as a viable solution for the conflict, or maybe they are looking at freezing this over while they can rebuild the Ukrainian armed forces. And perhaps that's, if you want to get into domestic politics, perhaps that's the reason why you have somebody like Trump going on about talking about how he can end this war in 24 hours. Now, of course, a lot of that is rhetoric, a lot of that is just Trump playing into his personality, playing into his base. But you do have to wonder if they do let somebody like that in power and let him actually negotiate a peace, what's that peace going to look like? Is it going to be kicking the can down the road? Is it going to have the airs of detente? Is it going to look like something that it actually looks like the approval of improvement? Excuse me, not approval. Sorry, it's been a little bit of a long day. The improvement of relations, or is it going to be very explicitly kicking the can down the road? Because I think both sides understand if there is any sort of freeze in the conflict, it is kicking the can down the road, and that this will have to be resolved by force, probably, unfortunately, at some point. But the question is, what is the understanding of that agreement? Is it out there in the open, or is that something that, or is that a dagger you're holding behind the back of this proverbial or quite literal handshake, perhaps? And like I said, those are all questions worth speculating on. But I don't want to spend all day repeating the same thing. But from what I've seen from the summit, despite exhaustion, despite dissatisfaction with this, despite even the outcome of, say, the French elections, where you can say a lot about the new Popular Front, but a lot of their members, a lot of supporters of their faction, are at least skeptical of the Ukrainian project, and certainly same with the right-wing faction with RN, or National Rally in France. You can't say as much about the UK. You can say somewhat in the US with the parts of the Republican voter base that they're more exhausted of perpetual involvement in these conflicts. But looking at what NATO puts on at their summit, this war is far from over, as far as they're concerned. And that they're going to push this as long as they can. And that the cliche "to the last Ukrainian" is an understatement. I know I've said this before. But not only is it going to be to the last Ukrainian, it's going to be the last Pole if they have it their way. It's going to be the last Romanian if they have it their way. And just keep on inserting NATO countries until you reach critical mass, and either one side triumphs or the other. That's the narrative I see coming out of NATO right now. Now, perhaps my take on this is completely off base. Perhaps I will be made a fool of. In this case, I will be happy to be wrong. But given the rhetoric that's come out of NATO at their own summit, given the rhetoric that has come out of NATO since the beginning of this war, since before the beginning of this war, they have no intentions for any sort of stable solution to this conflict or to the Russian question in general, beyond collapsing Russia, beyond regime change, beyond everything else we've seen before. And I don't think that's a reasonable answer. Love Russia, hate Russia. I do not believe for a second that is a reasonable answer. How could it be? What is reasonable about that? How do you plan to accomplish this? Do you think that you're going to break down the walls of the Kremlin and all of a sudden all the Russian resources are just going to be at your disposal? That you're going to break it up into a series of weakened puppet states and that you can command this? That there's going to be no greater ramifications to any sort of destabilization effort in Russia? To the point where, in their own contradictory words, a lot of NATO officials, including even some in the United States, expressed concerns about allowing Ukraine to strike deeper into Russia proper because that concern that would destabilize Russia and create a situation that they are not prepared to handle. Of course, that was another point that Zelensky tried to go on, trying to secure position to strike deeper into Russia with the long-range Western weapons, particularly American weapons, because they've only approved small areas, particularly near Belgorod and Kursk, in order to use these weapons. But they want to push that further because when it comes to Ukraine's prospects in the war, that's really all they have left up their sleeve. And in that same vein, you have the U.S. now moving their long-range missiles to Germany, and they are leaning on the Germans to develop their own long-range missile program. A market escalation in terms of armament in Europe, something that we haven't seen in quite some time. I would say, arguably even since the end of the Cold War, when it comes to level of escalation, level of armament. I know that you had the returning of nuclear-capable subs to Cuban ports by the Russians. That did happen as part of the greater escalation, but it does continue, and it is a constant tit for tat. It is a constant escalation. Neither side is willing to back down. Both sides are digging in on this, which creates a very dangerous situation, especially with the number of opportunities over the past 20 years. And I'll say once again, love Putin, hate Putin. Many chances for reconciliation for the past 20 years, spurned them all. Past 20 plus years, spurned them all. And I don't want to be too much of a pessimist, but the situation lends itself where it's going to keep escalating and somebody is eventually going to throw the first punch and we're all going to suffer the consequence of it. As people who live in the world, as people who live in, especially the Northern Hemisphere, I know that it's not like any major war wouldn't affect the entire world as a whole, but people who live in Europe, people who live in North America, even people who live in East Asia at that point, they're all going to suffer the consequences of this unending escalation. And call me biased, but I think you can place most of that on the shoulders of NATO, and the summit is no exception. It's gotten worse, as a matter of fact. What one might think of war exhaustion, what one might look at the population in NATO countries and their weariness for supporting these projects, supporting these endless intervention campaigns, even if it's not direct military involvement, it's disregarded because up until a certain point, I should say, you can disregard public will as much as you want. Now, there's some things where it just reaches critical mass that you have to acquiesce to the population. I think you look at some of Starmer's policies in the UK, which we'll get into in a little bit here. That is the case when it comes to trying to bring back order, and some of his more unpopular proposals that were dropped almost immediately, or just the air of stability that he might give. But on a lot of issues, public opinion can just be safely disregarded. And Ukraine is one of those issues where even people who were on Ukraine's side for much of this, who have grown exhausted with this at the prospect of Ukraine not being able to secure anything that resembles a victory, safely ignored, and escalation continues. And when it comes down to this, who do you think is going to be actually bearing the brunt of the consequences of these actions? It's going to be people like you and me. And especially if you live in Europe, it's going to be even worse because you're much closer to ground zero on that. And I don't envy your position at all. I'm not saying it would be great for North America, but it's not something I want to think about. But unfortunately, I don't want to say it's an inevitability, but there are many people hell-bent on trying to make this as irreversible as Ukraine's alleged NATO membership. But with all that being said, I suppose I can get into some of the news out of both France and the UK when it comes to their elections. So I'll start with the UK. Keir Starmer won a solid majority, as I had covered last week. And it does look like the first move that the Labour government is going to take of any great degree is a reintegration with the European Union. Now, they aren't going to come back crawling to the European Union, kiss the feet of Brussels, and say, we're sorry for ever leaving, and you should forgive us and accept us back in the Union. No, it's going to be the worst of both worlds, as a matter of fact, where the Labour government, Starmer, who of course is, as anyone who follows British politics would know, very close to the old guard Labour Party, Tony Blair, not to be confused with the several Albanian men who share his name, Tony Blair, but the former British Prime Minister is as influential as ever in British politics, so you already have the permanent government taking its proper role in all of this, much more directly this time. But you look at the proposed deals with the European Union. Now, nothing has really been ironed out too much yet, and it's going to be reintegration into the Union, compliance with European Union rules, and integration with the continent, with none of the benefits that they previously had. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying Brexit was a mistake. The sentiments behind it were very understandable, and had I been British, had I lived in the UK, I probably would have voted for it too. So I don't fault anyone for supporting it. I do think that, principally, abstractly speaking, it was the right call. It was the right move. But when it came down to reality, whether it was through sabotage, whether it was through just the reality of the situation, perhaps there was no escaping this outcome, it simply didn't work. And the British are arguably worse off without it. It's hard to judge because the situation the UK would be in today, had Brexit not happened, would be bad in its own right, but in a much different way. So it is hard to compare this here. It's just a matter of how do you want... Pick your poison, really. Do you want to deal with the consequences of being outside the European Union and having to more or less play by the rules, or by the rules of the American Empire in general? Or do you want to keep your wagon hitched to this clearly broken and decrepit system? The one good thing I can say came out of it was it had some brief positive influences on continental politics. And I know that's probably not much consolation for the British. What do they care about the continent in comparison to their own condition? Which, hey, fair enough. If I was British, once again, I would care about Britain's well-being over that of France or Germany or any of these other countries. But looking at it globally, looking at it on the map, looking at it from just my personal sympathies, I do have to say, there were some minor positive reverberations in the continent seeing the UK's departure. Not that I support the European Union really in any capacity. I think the idea of taking the European Union for the right wing is completely brain dead. That's never going to happen. You're not going to get the Euro-federalist fantasy that dilutes people to the point where they think Macron is going to be a great man of Europe. He's going to be the next Napoleon, our great leader. No, it's delusional. It's delusional. I'm sorry, but anyone who thinks that. I mean, I know I've had positive things to say about him in the past, and that he did explore different directions, but once the Ukraine war happened, he fell right in line. And he might try to grandstand, he might try to make himself look like a greater man than he is and take the real leadership role. But when push came to shove, he turned into a good Atlantis boy, and that's all they could have ever asked for him. What more could you expect from the former banker? Really, what else could you? But of course, migration in the UK is going to continue unmitigated. The Labour government is only going to make things more intense in that regard. I still can't blame you guys for throwing out the Conservatives. I would have done the same, especially given their ineffective governance. And it might be good to let the left play their hand here. And I can only hope. I don't want my pessimism to take over. I do generally hope, but also doubt that this does present a front for the more genuine right to come in and have a voice in the country and influence the country. And like I said, I hope that does happen, but I have my doubts. And what's likely going to happen is beyond some populist backlash, some anti-establishment backlash, it's going to return to business as usual because these systems are just too set in stone. And that, in my opinion, really the only way that there's any sort of change here is watching these systems degrade or erode themselves. And how long that might take, who knows? That just depends on a lot of events. But at this point, when it comes to people like you and me, people who are of the more, I guess you could say, genuine right, in a lot of cases, I do think there are some exceptions, but in a lot of cases, it is just a matter of riding out the storm. And that might not be the answer you want to hear. That's not the answer I want to hear, certainly. But that might just be the reality of the situation. And to the people of the UK, once again, I think that is probably the best you can do. And I know that's a hard answer to hear when the situation is as urgent as it is, but there simply is no avenue of any real resistance. And of course, I'm not advocating anyone doing anything crazy or illegal or anything, but in terms of actually standing your ground against everything that we oppose, I don't need to get into an exhaustive list here. It's going to be a long process, and like I said, I'm afraid that both parties, Labour and Conservative, as much as I would love them both to fade into irrelevance for the sake of the British people, they're going to find a way to crawl their way out of this hole because Labour's going to do the exact same thing the Conservatives did, just on a more blatant and intense scale. And then, likely it's going to be handed back off. The baton is going to be passed for more liberalism driving the speed limit, as the old cliche goes. But I don't want to cast too many not doubts, but I don't want to cast too much despair on the situation in the UK or be too pessimistic. I, of course, have my thoughts, and I do have my genuine opinion on this, but I don't want to dwell on this and really just mope about a situation that's really out of anyone's control. Now, much more interestingly, we can talk about the French elections here and the hung parliament for the second round. So, the ultimate results was the New Popular Front, the NFP, won 182 seats. The Centre won 186 seats. And the National Rally, the National Front, as it used to be known, took home 143 seats, with other minor parties picking up the remaining seats. And so far, it's in a position where nobody can form a governing coalition. They are all in the minority. And all of the parties have pledged not to work with each other. Now, I know it was impossible. I know it would have never happened. But I don't even want to say I was hoping for it. But I thought the most interesting outcome, which we have seen in places like Slovakia, where you do get the left-wing, right-wing coalition on a, for lack of a better word, populist platform. And I was under no illusion that was ever going to happen, but I still think that is the most interesting outcome. But the NFP, which is a coalition in and of itself of various left-wing parties, and the National Rally, they would never be able to cross that bridge. Even you're not going to unite left and right populism to the degree that the NFP was even left populism, which I think to a degree it was, but I don't want to overstate it. But of course, the most unfortunate outcome of this was the center remained in a strong second, and they were able to weather yet another storm. Going back to the first round results, it was the NFP, the RN, and then the center. But as what always happens in the second round, because this is just the way the French elections are structured, the center came crawling back. They were able to pull themselves out of the depths and resecure their position. But fortunately, they can't form a majority. They did take losses. Let's not understate the losses that they took. And they took a blow in credibility. And how this will shape the 2027 election, given the electoral outcomes, given what they would want, just the general political climate of France, I should say, I could see it lending itself to a left-wing government. Now, this wouldn't be the first time, nor would it be anything greatly transgressive. I know the issue right now is Mélenchon, or Mélenchon, I believe, is the French pronunciation, of the leader of the NFP, of the coalition, where he does have some of the more transgressive views on foreign policy, particularly on the issue of Israel. To a lesser extent, the issue going on with Russia, Ukraine, and NATO, but particularly on Israel and the Middle East, where he does have the unorthodox foreign policy takes, which presents a problem for the center. And the speculation right now is that the NFP, in its loose coalition, is going to try to oust him, find a much more amenable left-wing leader in order to form a coalition with the center and continuing governing France in the ground. That's what I think will probably happen in the French elections, because they can't call another election for a year. It's not like they can call another snap election. French law prevents that. And I also don't think that the results were bad enough for Macron to be forced into a resignation, because the center, you don't want to say the center held, but the center held on. Just able to barely claw its way back up to relevance and beat out the right wing. Now, National Rally, for all their faults, everything good and bad about them, are going to have a major voice in the parliament, and they are going to be able to, hopefully, one would hope, affect some change, or at least serve as a stumbling block to something worse. And I know there are some very good elements of National Rally, and there's also some very compromised elements of National Rally. I don't like to stake too much hope in a lot of these right-wing movements anywhere in the Western world just because of that. But in terms of ones that actually have potential, under the right circumstances, under the right pressure, I do think National Rally could impress me. I know, fortunately, even with Le Pen, despite all her faults, and I have a lot of criticisms of Le Pen, don't get me wrong, is open to forming coalitions in the European Parliament with Orban and with Salvini. Once again, men who you can say a lot about, but compared to what is on the rest of the continent, very much respect them, especially Orban, especially in light of his recent diplomatic visits. Which, in a way, if you're signing on, it isn't an explicit agreement, but it shows that to some degree you are okay with that sort of rhetoric and those sort of actions. And you've had also, throughout National Rally's history, criticisms of NATO. I know some people have gone as far as to say that they're the real spiritual successors of de Gaulle versus the French Republican Party, which, given the current state of the French quote-unquote center-right, I do think is a fair assessment to a degree. But there's also some compromising that has taken place where Le Pen has gone back on some of her comments about NATO, some of her comments about Crimea, and trying to make it a bigger issue than it is, and walking along the establishment line with that. So, like I said, nothing is perfect there, but in terms of right-wing movements, I I don't want to say optimistic about because that's not true. But in terms of right wing movements, I wouldn't dismiss out of hand. National Rally does have to be one of them. And I would have to see what happens when they get in power, what they do on immigration. Like I said, their foreign policy isn't terrible. They could be very easily compromised. We could see a Maloney situation where the Gladio wing, the Gladio nationalists do win, and they do continue going along with the self-destructive foreign policy of many Western nations. And then to add insult to injury, also going along with the migration case, because that's exactly what happened in Italy. That's exactly what happened with Maloney. You think, even if we go along with, say, the Ukrainian war, or go along with any of the other ridiculous projects, support Israel, etc., they'll throw us a bone and they'll let us do what we want on migration. Well, as we saw with Italy, that is most certainly not the case. They will actually use that as an excuse to press more upon you because you've shown yourself to be amenable on one issue. And if you're amenable on one issue, as far as the European elite is concerned, you're amenable on all the issues, and you're going to give more and more and more until we can't demand any more of you, and then you're going to give even more. Because that's how European politics works. Not just European politics, but that's especially how European politics works post World War II. And I would say, especially in this modern era, especially with the revival of the issue of Ukraine, the issue of migration, it's just a constant leaning on these countries to accept, like I said, more and more. They're going to demand. The more you give, the more they're going to demand. And Hungary, to its credit, especially for such a small nation, able to put its foot down, and they still do make outrageous demands of Hungary, but it has shown itself that it has shown the continent that resistance is possible if you're willing to play your cards right. But it does come at consequences. You do see some of the economic penalties that have been taken against Hungary. You do see some of the diplomatic penalties that have been taken against Hungary within the European Parliament. And if you're some nations, especially if you don't have, say, the economic ties to Russia and China that Hungary does, it is a much less enticing prospect. But like I said, I do hope that National Rally, if they were able to get in power, or if they somehow pull off this parliamentary nightmare and manage to secure some sort of coalition against all odds, which I don't think is going to happen. And I know that it would be focused on mostly domestic policy with what we're talking about right now, but even projecting in the future in 2027, I would hope that they would learn a lesson from Orban, from Fidesz, from the Hungarians, that an alternate way actually is possible. But I have to have my doubts, unfortunately. Like I said, I'd be more hopeful for them than, say, just about any other right wing party on the continent, barring the AFD. But ultimately, it comes back to what I was saying about the UK. A lot of this just comes down to having to ride out the storm and having to wait out this situation because at the end of the day, electoral politics, parliaments, governments, they're not going to actually address these issues. And like I said, that's not a call to action. That's not me telling anyone to do anything. But at the end of the day, these organizations are going to prove themselves ineffective. And I think that we're very rapidly approaching that point, and a lot of people are recognizing it. And while it does certainly, it is a bitter pill to swallow, it is also a necessary one for many scenarios with that. But moving on to the Middle East, just to round out the show, not to dwell on this for too long, and we'll get into some U.S. politics at the end of that. The most monumental news out of the Middle East is the election of Masoud Pezeshkian, the new Iranian president, after the unexpected death of Raisi, the former Iranian president who died in a helicopter crash. And just some brief facts on Pezeshkian. He won on the reformer faction. He rode into power in areas consisting of a large amount of ethnic minorities. I mean, he is himself ethnically Turkic from an Azeri and other mixed background, and lived in a Kurdish region in Iran. So He's not ethnically Persian. He is promised moderate reforms on social issues, as I'm sure you recall the uh, so-called women's protest that took place in Iran about a year and a half ago. He has spoken somewhat to those crowds. He is pro JCPOA, and I would say most importantly, given Iran's position, given some of the shifts we've seen in the region lately, he is in favor of having very good relations with Turkey. And that also comes from his Turkic ethnic background. Like I said, there's some Azerian there, there's other Turkic groups, but I do believe he actually does speak Turkish. That is one of the languages he speaks. And that recently you did get Iran and Turkey continuing to trade oil. So that ties more into what's been happening with Turkey lately with their mending of relations with Syria, where it does seem that all the cards are all the pieces are really falling into place for Syria, and that they can play their hand very well here. Where you have Erdogan wanting to reconcile after several years of being the spearhead of the Syrian opposition, sheltering them, arming them, occupying parts of Syria, but now you see Turkish forces starting to withdraw, and for about the past year, a desire for reconciliation between the two countries, for a desire to mend relations between them. And now that you have the Iranians, who also seek to get on good terms with Turkey, who are allies, and the Iranians, who are, of course, allies of Syria, that Pezeshkian has not broken his commitment to the so-called acts of resistance, has stated very much so that he is a large supporter of the Palestinian issue and that he wants to stand with Palestine against the Israelis, has reaffirmed his commitment to Syria, but also, in that same vein, as I had mentioned earlier, promised better relations with Turkey and also promised to continue the restoration of relations with Saudi Arabia as well. And on top of just his own ethnic background and the diplomatic maneuvering he's making, especially with Turkey, that also includes better relations with Azerbaijan, which Israel has tried to use as a hub for their operations in the region, especially against Iran. It is speculated that those Israeli strikes that took place back when Iran and Israel were trading blows did use Azeri airspace in order to conduct that operation. Now, Aliyev in Azerbaijan is a very slippery character. He holds no real loyalties. He's much like Erdogan in that sense, even though I would say Erdogan certainly is much more beholden to, say, his NATO obligations and has a much greater sense of the position he sees Turkey in. But Azerbaijan, being a much smaller country, of course, and much more geographically isolated country, Aliyev is a very slippery figure. He'll help the Israelis posture against Iran. He'll shake his fist at Russia when needed, but then meet with Putin the next day. And he'll, of course, play ball with Turkey because Turkey is their main sponsor and their primary ally. And even down to the issue with Armenia and the Nagorno-Karabakh, the Artsakh issue, Turkey was completely behind him with that. In fact, gave him the technology, gave the Azeris the technology for that drone war. But there's a possibility that Azerbaijan now, they're not going to break their ties with Israel, especially with how deeply entrenched Israel is in there. But Azerbaijan is, to speak in terms of a chessboard, in play. It is something, it is up for grabs, and that it probably will go back and forth, that Aliyev will play both sides on this issue. And perhaps that will gain the ire of both sides, and they will seek some sort of regime change or some sort of greater influence on Azerbaijan for that reason. But with Pezeshkian in power, if we're to take him at face value, if we're to believe a lot of what he says, then there is quite a bit of potential to restore the summits that, for example, we saw in 2018, 2019 of Turkey, Iran, and Russia on the issue of Syria, trying to broker some sort of peace in Syria. correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Rouhani was also from the reformist faction as well, which lended himself to that too. But once again, you have the building of more united front in the Middle East because of everything that has happened so far. And the Israeli war on Gaza, while they can get up there and they can grandstand, they can talk about their security all they want, has been very counterproductive in that regard when it comes to burning whatever bridges they had left with their neighbors and other countries in the region. But like I said, I'll get into news about Israel in just a moment here. But there stands the chance for a united front, for a common understanding between Iran and Turkey. Turkey is, like I said, is finally starting to back off on Syria, so there's opportunity for that to continue to decrease NATO influence in the area because Turkey's invasion was always done with the understanding. I mean, you look at the incursions in 2018. You look at the alleged deal that Trump and Erdogan cut back in 2019. While Turkey certainly had its own interests, it also, by proxy, served NATO and Western interests when it came to its intervention in Syria. But that's off the table now, and although there had been disputes before, the Americans find themselves more and more isolated in Syria, what few numbers they have left there. And, of course, their Kurdish allies also find themselves more and more isolated. There's questions of what's going to happen in Iraq because the Iranians have made great headway into Iraq, and, of course, Turkey has also conducted some operation against Kurdish forces there, and correct me if I'm wrong, but also has decent relationship with the central government in Baghdad, where that last pocket of American influence in Syria in the region, occupying those oil-rich fields of Syria, mind you, that have been crushing Syria economically and in terms of resources, they're more and more enclosed, and there's less and less the so-called SDF and their American sponsors can do in Syria. Syria is an afterthought, especially after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, especially after the outbreak of the Ukraine war, and especially after the outbreak of this next iteration of the Gaza war. Syria is a complete afterthought. Nobody gives it the time of day anymore. And I think that's further exemplified by the continuing improving relations between Syria and Saudi Arabia, where you have flights going from Damascus to Riyadh now. There was it was months ago, but Syria was restored to its membership in the Arab League, and all the countries that had arrayed itself against Syria in 2011, barring the U.S. and some of the other Western countries, have more or less made peace that Assad won the war, he's here to stay, and that if we want to do business in Syria, if we want to do business around Syria, if we want to continue with our aspirations, we're going to have to work with him, and that's just something we're going to have to learn to live with. I think that's in no small part thanks to Assad's diplomatic skill, because ever since he assumed office, he made a pivot to the West in the early 2000s. You had Syria withdraw from Lebanon. You had a cleaning of the house of the old guard in Syria, where he brought in a bunch of quote-unquote pro-Western people in the government. Now, that backfired when he ended up with the Arab Spring on his hands, and we ended up having to fight a civil war. And you could lay some blame at Assad's feet for some of his earlier actions, but ever since most of the unrest in Syria had been cleaned up, and since Russia got a greater foothold in the region and relations with Iran increased, Assad has managed to play his cards wonderfully. He's secured some level of Chinese investment. Now, the Chinese are a bit perturbed by the unrest in the country, particularly because one-fourth of the country still is occupied by the SDF, especially in the oil-rich regions, which, like I said, does deter some degree of Chinese investment. But he has managed to play all the countries around him and play all of the major players in the world in order to secure a pretty good position for Syria, especially in light of what very well could have happened, the fact that it could have been the next Iraq, the fact that it could have been the next Libya, and that largely thanks to his diplomatic skill, that was avoided. And unless there's some sort of revived attempt at regime change in Syria, I do think that'll continue. I do think that we will see that going into the future, and that, frankly, Assad won the war, and his reintegration into the Arab world, into the world at large, is an inevitability. Saudi Arabia has dropped the issue. Saudi Arabia was once again, with Turkey, one of the biggest supporters of the regime change operation, and the two main vectors in which the U.S. tried to effect regime change in Syria are now trying to diffuse tensions with Syria and have been for quite some time, and we're finally seeing real breakthroughs. What more can you say about that? A complete failure of the U.S. I mean, more embarrassing than Afghanistan, in my opinion. And the Afghan withdrawal was pretty embarrassing, but considering the resources and the diplomatic maneuvering we took in order to secure regime change in Syria, mostly on the behalf of Israel, mind you, and this is the end result, the fact that we more or less have been ejected from the region in terms of influence. Now, of course, the U.S. still does have a massive presence in the Middle East. Look no further than, say, Qatar or Bahrain or the Persian Gulf, but it is a shadow of what it used to be. And when you compare that to just the entire American campaign in the Middle East from 2000 onwards, it is an absolute shadow of what it used to be. The amount of money and lives and resources that we spent trying to turn the region into one much more amenable for our quote unquote interests, or perhaps the interest of a few of the American elite. I'm sure we all know which ones. Even by their own standards, even by the standards of the neoconservatives, American policy in the Middle East has been a complete failure. And look no further than Israel, which has still failed to dislodge Hamas from the Gaza Strip. Despite a heavy number of civilian casualties, they've still failed to dislodge Hamas from the Gaza Strip. And now there's speculation of opening the northern front against Hezbollah. Hezbollah, which managed to strike IDF positions in northern Israel just in the past few days. And I should also add, while we had brought up Syria, there were some strikes on Syrian forces in the Golan Heights, near the occupied Golan Heights. So tensions are ramping up there. But you do look at what the IDF actually does have to expend militarily in terms of manpower and resources. Diverting attention to the north is going to come at a great cost in the south, and that there's some speculation of a quote-unquote Hamas counteroffensive. Now, I don't know how far you could really go with that and what you could constitute as a counteroffensive, but point being is, the more resources they have to divert against one is going to cost them on the other front. So the question is, are they going to try to push this? Are they going to move into this, try to fight this ridiculous two-front war? Frankly, I don't think so. I think a lot of what's happening in the north is posturing, is bloviating for the sake of Netanyahu to stay in power. And how much will that succeed? I think the jury is really out on that. But not to dwell on one issue for too long, I will close out with some news in the U.S. And first off, you have some interesting news out of the Senate with Chuck Schumer and his relation to Biden. So let me just get the exact details right here, where he is privately signaling to donors, to the Democratic donors, who are currently very displeased with Joe Biden, especially in light of his recent public embarrassments, that he is open to pulling his support from Biden and snaking on him on a party level. Now, Schumer is Senate Majority Leader, so of course he has a great amount of influence in the Democratic Party, but it is still a major mover and shaker who probably could influence the convention. And I know that there has been talks at the convention in terms of trying to secure Biden's nomination before he gets there. And Biden, of course, went out and said that he has no intention of ever getting up the nomination and worded it very strongly as well. But at a certain point, it could just be that internal party politics completely does away with him. Now, I would imagine he probably has too much influence, probably has too many inside people for something like that to happen. But how far can he really push this? And I should note that this is, of course, a report from Axios. And Chuck Schumer publicly said, of course, he's publicly going to deny it, that he supports Biden and remains committed to making sure he is victorious in the election over Trump. But I mean, Schumer's not a stupid man. Think what you will of him. I completely believe that he would be participating in some sort of backroom coup in the lead up to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in August. And the media only continues their berating of Biden, that you only see more calls for him to step down and that he isn't fit. Only a select handful of shills are really explicitly pro Biden. There's a lot of people who are unenthusiastic supporters, as it might be. But in terms of people actually arraying themselves against him, beyond a few strong voices in the media, it's not that much. But like I said, I do not have a hard time believing at all that the donors who, of course, have a great deal of investment in making sure they win the election want to do away with Biden and wanted to do away with him as soon as possible. Like I said, I think a lot of these issues will remain up in the air until the DNC. Biden will likely hold on to power, but he's causing a complete rupture in the party. And I know the donors will, of course, back him over Trump, but there's nothing you can. This isn't an issue that's going to be easily mended, just to say the least. And that this is going to be a pervasive problem, especially if he does get the nomination, which, like I said, is more than likely. But who knows what the DNC is going to look like in terms of open resistance, in terms of the more left-wing factions of the party that are outraged over the Gaza issue, calling him Genocide Joe. It has the makings of a disaster, and I can't lie to you and say I'm not eager to see it, because I am eager to see what a clown show and what a mess the DNC is going to be. Now, on the other hand, we have the Republican National Convention coming up. Trump's sentencing has been delayed, of course, until September 18th. And so he will be able to go to the convention in Milwaukee, accept the nomination. There's no real challenger against Trump. And it's going to be business as usual. It's probably going to be an exact clone of the 2020 convention. I don't expect anything exciting. Probably the biggest piece of news that will come out is that we're going to get the nominee, and that's really what it comes down to. And there's speculation on who it's going to be. I know the one everyone is talking about is North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum, which is really just the Mike Pence move all over again. Just some straight-laced, friendly, quote-unquote looking Midwestern governor who puts a calming hand to the people who are on the fence about Trump. Much in the same vein, you've had speculations that Youngkin, Glenn Youngkin from Virginia, who came in, who flipped the seat of governor from the Democrats, and who is term limited anyway with the way the Virginia governor's seat works, is going to be the nominee. And I mean, I think frankly that would be the most prudent move on the part of the RNC. And then there are some of the more out there ones like Ben Carson, which I don't think is going to actually come to fruition. I could very easily see him resuming his role in the cabinet that he had before, but I don't think Ben Carson is going to be some great inner player within Republican Party politics or within a potential Trump administration or his running mate. Unfortunately, Kristi Noem was one of the other ones that was speculated, and she is the governor of South Dakota. But very exceptional woman, let's put it that way, in terms of some of the things she said. Her scandals about her memoirs and some of the things she talked about doing, there was that. And as far as electoral politics are concerned, if I'm to believe that any of this makes a difference, she's weak on a number of issues, particularly on a lot of social issues, in my opinion, at least. But I think most likely what we're going to get is we're going to get the Doug Burgum, excuse me, middle of the road, at least in terms of outward appearance, Midwestern governor who is going to, like I said, alleviate some of Trump's more on the fence supporters. But like I said, I think a lot of the speculation about VP is a bit secondary compared to the real issue at hand. And what I do want to explore, I don't want to dwell on this too long, but just to end the show out, that I am starting to think a Trump victory is more likely in the case that they do keep Biden. So of course, it's more or less a shoo-in for Trump, barring any, let's just say, extraordinary measures on the part of the Democratic Party or any other influential individuals or apparatuses. And then you let him come in. He bears the brunt of, say, a ceasefire in Ukraine. He's the one who looks responsible for that. He's Putin's puppet. He gave the ceasefire in Ukraine, which of course gives them more time to rearm, kick the can down the road, and restart this conflict eventually. Bear the consequences for any potential Middle Eastern policy, or perhaps, because of Ukraine, pivot to the Middle East. And also take blame for the state of the economy as well. And that they may be preparing to dump Biden in a very real sense and put Trump back in there, despite their posturing, despite their fear mongering, in order to let him take the fall for a lot of the things that are inevitably going to go wrong no matter who is in office. And like I said, I'm not saying that's a reason not to support Trump. I have my very clear feelings on electoral politics I've expressed many times. But like I said, I don't begrudge anyone for disagreeing with me on that or for still wanting to vote Trump for whatever reason. But I do fear that we might get a scenario where yes, he indeed does win, but is the fall guy, and that he's going to come in here and he's going to come back and they're going to heap blame on him. And I don't know, perhaps that's even worse than sentencing, letting him take the legacy of Joe Biden, letting him bear the consequences of a lot of Biden's actions. Like I said, I know a lot of these things were inevitable even before Biden got in office, and hell, before even Trump was in office the first time. But I do think that's a real possibility we have to look at, that they let some of these people win in order to let them bear the consequences. And that we may be looking at a very similar situation with Trump. But really, that's all I had for this week. I will certainly be back next time with another episode. Quite a bit more news to cover. A lot of stories that were a little open-ended that we don't have all the details on yet, that do lack a proper conclusion. So I'll come back as soon as possible to tie up loose ends on those and bring you any new pertinent information on any of the topics and more that we had just covered. And thank you everyone for tuning in, and have a nice day.